Welcome back to World War II TV, and we have 4 shows this week as part of an Eastern Front week. I am your host, Paul Woodadge, and to talk today about the Holocaust in Lithuania is World War II TV regular, the always popular Prit Buttar, who's also on World War I TV, our sister channel, tomorrow. So if you enjoy hearing him today, tomorrow we're going back about 20-odd years and talking about the formation of the Baltic states at the end of the First World War. But I'll bring Prit in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Good evening, Woody, and good evening, everyone else. I'm very well indeed. Cold this month so far, but June up here in Scotland was a blinder, so you can't have everything.
No, well, I mean, it's been raining here a lot today, but we haven't talked particularly about how you go about the different types of research, because you've done the First World War, you've done the Second World War, you do work with NATO and things like staff rise, but you also touch on the Holocaust. Touch on it. You've read a lot about it. Do you approach those subjects with exactly the same kind of mentality, or do you treat them differently?
The Holocaust was easily the toughest bit of writing I've engaged in. The more I touched on this in my book about the Baltic states in the Second World War, and the more I dug into that, the more I felt there were stories here that really needed to be told. When it actually came to writing the book, of all the books I've written, it was by several orders of magnitude the toughest thing I have ever written. There were many days when I switched the computer off and took my elderly dog out for a long, long walk just to clear my head of the images. And my apologies in advance, there may well be occasions during today's talk where if you see me choking up, please just politely look the other way, because for me, this has been an incredibly emotional journey. And Timothy Snyder, the American historian, I think he summed it up beautifully. I've tried to, but not quite as eloquently as him. I describe this as emotional arithmetic. If we could, most of us have experience of one bereavement in our lives. If we could multiply that according to the number of deaths that we see in news stories, we might not allow these things to happen again, but we really don't. And Timothy Snyder put it beautifully when he said, rather than thinking of the Holocaust as 6 million deaths, think of it as one bereavement repeated 6 million times in succession. And that is the scale of what happened. And, people say that an awful lot of things, the emotional connection with them fades when it is more than one lifetime ago. So we're getting to that stage with the Second World War and with the Holocaust and all of the other things that happened. It is so important that we do not allow that emotional memory to pass, because it's the only tiny, tiny hope we have that we might not allow this to happen again.
Well, what a great opener. And you're right. It's as it recedes in the past, it becomes our duty to talk about it and find ways of talking about it to bring in the different generations who have different experiences and less connection with it. But that's a subject of the day. But you've come on with a PowerPoint, and folks, it's going to be quite a dark show tonight. Obviously, Holocaust shows always are. But if you have questions, fire them away. But I think Prit will take us through this, as he always does, from A to Z, in pretty exemplary fashion. So over to you, Prit, and let's hear about Lithuania and its connection with the Holocaust.
Well, thank you, Woody. This is not the full story of the Holocaust. I'm very much concentrating on personalities in order to give you people around whom you can anchor this, and then I'll leave you to do your own reading afterwards. If we could go to the first slide. If you ask people what comes to mind when they think of the Holocaust, it's usually images like this. People in striped pajamas, often far more malnourished than these poor children in this image. But it's the memory of, or the shared memory of gas chambers, of crematoria, of barbed wire fences around concentration camps, etc. And people sometimes forget or are not aware that by the time the industrialized killing in the death camps got underway in the second quarter of 1942, there were already hundreds of thousands of people who had been killed in what became known as the Holocaust by bullets. And this was perpetrated by the Germans almost as soon as they crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Well, if we move on to the next slide, we're going to run through some of the villains and the monsters first. And in pride of place amongst them is this man, who was probably the second most senior official in the SS after Himmler. He was very typical of his generation of SS officers. And we'll touch on this in a little on the next slide too, because Reinhard Heydrich and others were people who were teenagers at the end of the First World War. So they hadn't experienced the frontline fighting, but they were old enough to feel this enormous sense of shame and humiliation, and they bought into the entire myth of the stab in the back legend, that the German army was undefeated, and it was the collapse of the home front under the influence of these evil communists that actually brought about the defeat of Germany. Like so many others, Heydrich was from a very affluent background. A fairly affluent background, and from that he also had the same casual anti-Semitism that was very widespread across that whole tier of society, all the way across Europe at the time. But going off to university at a time when there were lots of very hard right-wing groups becoming active in Germany, people like Heydrich got sucked into these and became very radicalized very quickly. So Heydrich is very instrumental in setting up the Einsatzgruppen, which we'll be talking about, that enter the Soviet Union on the coattails of the Wehrmacht and carry out the Holocaust by bullets. Franz Walter Stahlecker is very, very typical of the sort of men that Heydrich recruited. This was Heydrich's vision of the future of Germany. Again, a guy who was a teenager at the end of the First World War. Again, from his sort of social class, generally anti-Semitic, I guess in a way that, having grown up in Britain in the 1970s, the sort of racism that I was familiar with in the 60s and 70s, not necessarily violent, but we just don't like these people. But of course, he goes off to university, he gets involved in extreme right-wing politics. And here's the interesting thing, Stahlecker, by the time he is appointed commander of one of the Einsatzgruppen going into the Soviet Union, he has a doctorate in law. These are not stupid people. These are very, very highly educated people, but they have just been radicalized by exposure to extreme views at a critical time in their lives. And, the parallels are there for people to see. You look at the way that, well-to-do people from Saudi Arabia, etc., have been radicalized by radical Islam. You look at the way that people have been radicalized by far-right groups in Europe and North America. There is this time when people are very, very receptive to these sorts of ideas, particularly if they resonate with, pre-existing beliefs. So yeah, Stahlecker was one such character, and very, very typical of that whole generation of people. You've got to get away from this idea that they are all mindless, murderous, psychopathic thugs. They were very, very clever and very intelligent people. But
I'm just glad you mentioned that, because the sidebar is filling up with what a monster Heydrich is, and of course he absolutely is. But he was also very intelligent and knew exactly what he was doing, and was very creative in how he put together his team. So I think you can be awful and horrible and murderous, but also be bright, and I think that they're the more scary ones. Some of the thugs who were just mindless, they're scary, but it's the intelligence which comes with the really scary ones, I think.
Exactly. So I've been writing about 1944 this summer, and I come across these awful people like Dörlewanger
Mm.
and the like, and yes, they are just the ultimate sort of individuals that you would put in the ground and not lose a second's sleep over. But Stahlecker and co are much more frightening in many ways. They are very articulate, very intelligent, and very, very persuasive. So if we move on to the next slide, one of Stahlecker's subordinates in the Baltic states was this man, Karl Jäger, and he is very, very different from most of the SS. He's a lot older. Jäger was an artilleryman in the First World War on the Western Front. There's a pretty good set of evidence that he was traumatized by his experiences and he suffered from PTSD. His marriage fell apart very rapidly after his return to Germany. He appears to have missed that whole sense of camaraderie that he had grown up with in the army on the Western Front. He became involved in the Nazi Party at an early age. Originally, I would have to say that he was not really anti-Semitic. He got a job with a Jewish employer and was perfectly happy and worked very, very well with his boss. But once he joined the Nazi Party, of course, that started to change. By the time he comes to Stahlecker's attention and then on Stahlecker's coattails joins the SS and becomes one of the men who will serve under him in the Baltic states, by then he has completely embraced all of the Nazi ideology. And also in his case, you have this terrifying concept that he feels that so many of his contemporaries look down on him. They regard him as inferior because he is not a university-educated man. He's older than them. So he feels he has something to prove. And as a result of that, he is going to be far more zealous purely to prove that he is every bit as good as the Stahleckers and these others who are, if you like, his intellectual superiors, his educational superiors, in some respects, his social superiors. He also has a huge chip on his shoulder because although he joined the Nazi Party at a very early age, when the Nazi Party was outlawed after the failed beer hall putsch and Nazi Party records were destroyed, his old party number was lost. So he failed to qualify as an Alter Kämpfer originally, and then had to prove by producing witnesses that he had been in the Nazi Party for a very, very long time. So again, that leaves him with this sense of, I have a lot to prove. And my goodness, he's going to go out of his way to prove that. So if we move on to the next slide, 4 Einsatzgruppen accompanied the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union. And remind me, have you had Waitman Bjorn on this show?
We have
Yes.
twice or 3 times, yeah.
Excellent. So Waitman sums this up beautifully in one of his books, where he says that you have to get this the right way around. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union in order to massacre people. The massacres didn't occur because they had happened to invade the Soviet Union and fighting commenced. Barbarossa was, from the outset, a genocidal project. And these 4 Einsatzgruppen were going to be instrumental in this. The first Einsatzgruppen appeared at the time of the annexation of Austria, and then they evolved over a period of time after that. 2 Einsatzgruppen accompanied Army Group South, 1 Army Group Center, and Einsatzgruppe A under Stahlecker entered the Baltic states. As you can see, it's made up of 4 subunits, various commandos. The total strength of Einsatzgruppe A was probably fewer than 1,400 men. We're not talking of a large force. This is like a reinforced battalion. And yet it is going to be responsible for the murder of tens or hundreds of thousands of people, which gives you a clue into how it's going to be done. You can't do it just with the personnel of this group. It's going to be done by using local people who are going to be involved heavily in the killing. So before the Germans invade, they're in touch with nationalist movements, and particularly from Lithuania and Estonia, and also from Ukraine. Not so much from Belarus, because there really isn't an anti-Bolshevik nationalist movement in Belarus for them to exploit. They lead these people on, they encourage them they encourage them in not so many words to believe that the Germans are going to help them with their aspirations to statehood, but in fact they're just using them. Alfred Rosenberg, the great racial theorist of the Nazi Party, had coined the expression Jewish Bolshevism. And by the time you get to 1939 and certainly 1941, this is absolutely accepted across the board, across the whole breadth of German government and the military, that Bolshevism is the enemy of Germany, and particularly National Socialist Germany. On top of that, most Jews are Bolsheviks. Given that we have to kill all the Bolsheviks in order to protect Germany, ergo the Jews have to die. And they managed to persuade the Lithuanians and the Ukrainian nationalists to think similarly. Ukrainian nationalists are already fairly anti-Semitic at this stage. Lithuania, I could go into a long rabbit hole about this, so I won't. Historically, Lithuania had actually been one of the better places in Eastern Europe for Jewish people to live, but a year of Soviet occupation had left a slightly erroneous mindset in Lithuania that the Jews had been helping the Soviets. So, the Nazi propaganda fell on very fertile soil.
And just a quick question, Prit,
yes.
because in case we get any ridiculous apologists watching this who say that anything that happened out there was only ever a retaliation for partisan activities and things like that, this was planned right from the outset, wasn't it? I just want, I know you know that, and I know that. I want you to hear it in your words.
No, thank you. And that was absolutely worth saying, because when the Einsatzgruppen were being set up at Pret Castle in East Germany, they were briefed that your job is security in the immediate rear area behind the front line. So you must eliminate all active and potential sources of resistance to German occupation. And our man Heydrich and various other senior SS officers impressed upon the personnel of the Einsatzgruppen that this would involve killing an awful lot of Jews. And one of the officers from the Einsatzgruppen actually asked him to clarify this and said, does this mean we are to kill women and children? And the reply was, it was very typical of the way that the SS operated, in that Heydrich turned to him and just said, aber das ist selbstverständlich. That is self-evident. So you're basically telling them to do it, but you're not saying it in so many words, and you're not putting it in writing. But yes, they were absolutely, from the outset, going to kill the Jews. And, the orders were sent out that you must encourage nationalists to rise up and kill Jews in pogroms as soon as the Wehrmacht arrives, but you must keep the German involvement and instigation hidden. So as soon as the Wehrmacht arrived in Lithuania, the killings began. There were some appalling massacres, particularly in Kaunas, where some Lithuanian nationalists stood in a disused petrol station. Gangs of nationalists brought Jews there, and they beat them to death. And a crowd that watched cheered. Some held their children up on their shoulders so they could watch the killing. And at the end of the killing, one of the perpetrators sat on the pile of corpses, produced a harmonica, and played the Lithuanian national anthem for the applause and cheers of the crowd. But this was instigated by the Germans. Afterwards, when some German soldiers and officers complained, they were told in no uncertain terms, these are Selbstreinigung Aktionen, self-cleansing operations, nothing to do with us, which is completely untrue.
Wow.
So if we go on to the next slide, So Karl Jäger was commander of Einsatz Kommando 3, which was responsible for Lithuania, which is where we're going to be. One of his subordinates was this man, Joachim Hamann, really quite violently anti-Semitic individual. And he set up an organization called the Rollkommando Hamann, which was responsible for mass killings all across Lithuania. At the time, Lithuania was not a very industrialized nation. It still isn't really. So in order to kill the rural population, the Rollkommando Hamann would notify the local police that it was coming. A day in advance. The local police would identify a suitable killing ground, would round up the Jews, and then Hamann's group would turn up. Him, a handful of other German officers and soldiers, plus a large number of Lithuanian paramilitaries. They would execute the Jews by gunshot. There would be liberal amounts of alcohol involved. There were, numerous stories of these people being by the end of the day being so drunk they could barely stand up. And then they'd return to barracks and do it all again a couple of days later. All the way through this, Karl Jäger, the head of Einsatzgruppe 3, the Einsatzkommando 3, the artilleryman from the First World War who has a thing to prove, when he first sees the mass killings, he is absolutely horrified and appalled, but he becomes meticulous in enforcing enforcing the orders he has been given, because he has to prove to himself and everybody else he is as good as, if not better than, everybody else. He keeps a meticulous record of the number of Jews killed and where. And you can, if you look up the Jäger report on the internet, you will find excerpts from it, and he lists, men, women, and children at each site and each date. It is just the most chilling document. Question from Terry about the involvement of the German army. Stahlecker writes in his reports early on in the operation, relations with the Wehrmacht are generally very good. In some cases, as with Höppner's Panzer Group, positively cordial. So you know what? The Wehrmacht is absolutely waist deep in all of this. All of this nonsense of a clean Wehrmacht, absolutely not. They know precisely what's going on. They're heavily involved. After all, they're providing ammunition for these killings. These bullets have to come from somewhere. And the officers must know where these bullets are going. They're under orders to hand over any, and when they hand over prisoners of war, they're asked to sort out communists from non-communists, commissars, etc. So they know full well what's going on. They've also been ordered to hand over Jews, etc. So absolutely, they are absolutely involved to a greater or lesser extent. Soldiers who turn up, they take photographs of what's happening. They are witness to what's happening. All of the personnel of the Einsatzgruppen, even if they are clerks and cooks and drivers and bottle washers, they all take part in the killings. This becomes a problem later on, because when you want to prosecute these people under various jurisdictions, you can't just prosecute people for killing someone. You have to have named individuals. So if you know, for example, that everybody in Einsatzkommando 3 was responsible for pulling a trigger somewhere in Lithuania, unless you can prove exactly where and when, prosecution becomes very difficult. But nevertheless, they were all involved. And certainly the Wehrmacht knew, and there's no two ways around this.
Thank you.
If we carry on to the next slide, we're now moving away from the Einsatzgruppen and into the personnel who are responsible for the ghettos. Because once you've started this slaughter with the local people taking action against the Jews under German instigation, this becomes an excuse for ghettoization, because you can then turn on the Jews and say, you've brought this upon yourselves, but we're going to put you in ghettos for your protection. And this is a clue as to how the Holocaust unfolds, because if you say to people, we're doing this for your protection. A few people will believe that, and it gives them a straw to cling to as a, if you like, a reason why they shouldn't resist and why they shouldn't fight back. But all of the ghettos that were set up, most of them at least, they followed a standard pattern. You'd have a large ghetto and a small ghetto, and the purpose of this was you could close the ghettos, you could take off the population of the small ghetto for execution, and then you could redistribute the population afterwards. So once the ghettos were set up, Martin Weiss here was one of the SS officers responsible for the ghetto in Vilnius. He was known to the local Jews as Weiss der Schwarz, Weiss, the white, the black. Notoriously involved in numerous murders, and we will come across him later, a thoroughly unpleasant man, and very, very characteristic of, relatively low-ranking individual, but who had enormous power of life and death over other people. The next character is, if you would, I've spent a lot of time writing about the Second World War and about the various appalling things that were done. If you wanted me to give you one person who, they always say when you're criticizing politicians or whatever, you should always criticize policies, not the individual. Well, I'll happily make an exception for this man. If you wanted me to summon up one person that I could send to eternal damnation forever, it would be this man. He became known as the Butcher of Vilnius. He was a former Luftwaffe officer who was then transferred to the SS. He ended up in Vilnius. He was involved in some of the early killings in the ghettos, rounding up random people, sending them off to the execution grounds. So by now we're into the autumn of 1941, and what these people are doing is they are organizing the Jews into work gangs, and these work gangs are variously clearing rubble from the fighting, or they're building airfields or whatever. And sometimes they return to the ghetto, other times they're just marched off to execution grounds and shot. And there is now a fairly standard policy. They're marched off, and they are near Vilnius. There was a fuel storage facility that was being built by the Red Army before the Germans arrived. So there were these pre-dug trenches, and yes, this was at Panari, Stuart, as you say, and the Jews would be marched into these trenches and would then be beaten and shot. Why were they beaten before they were shot? Well, it's all part of, I suppose, brutalizing the people involved. If you've been pummeling people with your rifle butt, it's easy to point the other end of the gun at them and pull the trigger, Anyway, Murra was responsible for food supplies to the ghetto. He oversaw a brutal regime of searches of returning work parties with random and arbitrary beatings and killings of Jews who were attempting to smuggle mediocre amounts of food back into the ghetto. Absolute monster. And my goodness, I've got plenty more to say about him. So we're going to move on to the next character, Bruno Kittel. Kittel, we're jumping ahead in the story here a little bit. Kittel was Murra's replacement. Now, he's an interesting character in that if you look him up on Wikipedia or elsewhere, there's a problem here. The date of birth you often see for him must be wrong, because according to that date of birth, he would have been about 20 or 21 when he arrived in Lithuania. And yet he had a previous career as an actor. Now, the date of birth has to be wrong. And this is important because we'll come back to that later. He was known to the Jews as just the devil incarnate. He was always perfectly turned out, smelled of cologne, perfectly shaven. On occasion, he had a piano, an upright piano brought into the ghetto. He would play the piano one-handed whilst holding a pistol with the other hand and using it as he saw fit. Just the most appalling person. I could go on about him, but we got a lot of ground to cover. So let's kind of move on to the next. We're moving away from the monsters, thank goodness. Let's look at some of the lights. And we have to go back in time here. Some of you will know that between the fall of Poland and the onset of Barbarossa, this entire region came under Soviet control. They first of all moved troops into the area, then they had fixed elections in the three Baltic states, which returned 100% Communist Party members. One constituency in Lithuania proudly reported that turnout at the election was 125%, and this was seen as a good thing. The only item of business for the new communist governments was to apply for membership of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and so the three Baltic states became part of the Soviet Union. In 1940, when Germany invaded Holland, the Dutch government dismissed their consul in Riga because he had Nazi sympathies. Jan Swartendijk was the representative of the Philips Electrical Company in Kaunas, in Vilnius, in Lithuania, and he became the honorary consul. He was approached by a Jewish woman who asked him if he could provide her with documentation to leave Lithuania, because the Soviet authorities were perfectly happy to allow Jews to leave, but only if they had travel documents, including entry visas to wherever they were going to go. And they were prepared to sell them expensive tickets on the Trans-Siberian Railway to get them to Vladivostok, etc. The trick was to get the documents. So Swartendijk was persuaded by this Jewish woman to give her group what became known as the Curacao visas. Scott and I think Terry mentioned earlier on the importance of naming people, and I'm really concentrating on that. I'm not telling you the full details of this. I really, really feel that if you put names to this, you anchor it at a personal level, and I think that's really, really important. So Swartendijk, anyway, getting back to this gentleman, he started producing what were called the Curacao visas. So these didn't give you a right to enter any other Dutch territory, only Curacao. He had absolutely no authority to do this, but he just did it anyway. So he started producing dozens and dozens and dozens of these technically useless, but in practical terms, very, very worthwhile visas. So if we move on to the next slide, we then get to the next character, this wonderful, wonderful man, and I'm probably going to choke up now. Sugihara was the Japanese consul in Kaunas. He wrote to Tokyo and said, I am being, I'm deeply upset to see so many Jewish refugees trying to get out of Lithuania. Remember, this is before the German invasion. And he said, we should do something to help these people. He was told not to. But he then decided off his own authority to start issuing people with travel documents under the Imperial Japanese stamp. He produced thousands of these documents. It got to a stage where he was producing them without even bothering to put the names of the Jews on them and handing them out so that the Jews could fill them in themselves. In combination with Swartendijk's Curacao visas, this was sufficient for these people to get tickets on the Trans-Siberian Railway, get to Vladivostok, where purely by chance, an old college friend of Sugihara was the Japanese consul. And because he felt honor bound to honor what his old friend had done, he would then provide them with ongoing travel to Japan. You then had some farcical moments. I mean, I discovered this when I was researching my book on the Lithuanian Holocaust. There was a large Jewish community in, I think, the city of Kobe in Japan. I didn't know this. But the Jews there intervened because the Japanese government was getting very angry. At one point, a freighter arrived from Vladivostok with, I think, 46 male Jews aboard who all had the same name and date of birth on their documentation, because that was the way this had worked. But the local Jewish community persuaded the Japanese that if they arranged onward travel, then the Japanese just had to look the other way, and they did. And these Jews then traveled on to North America, to South America, to South Africa and Australia. And Sugihara and Svartendijk, between them, saved an enormous number of people before their consulates were closed down. But that's sort of, I put them in here because I wanted to get the monsters out the way first. And now here's a little bit of light. Moving on to the next bit of light, somebody's already mentioned about just how universal the Wehrmacht was in its complicity in what was happening. You know, if you want a person from the Second World War who should be your role model, this is your man. Anton Schmidt was a Viennese soldier who was, I think, 19 at the end of the First World War. He served on the Italian front in the Austro-Hungarian army. He returned to Vienna, where he set up an electrical repair and retail shop in a working class area of the city. He employed several Jews. There were lots of stories that at some point in his life he had had a Jewish sweetheart. Impossible to know one way or the other. But, you know, even though he was a passionate Catholic, he helped Jews enormously. For example, some of the Jews were part of a Jewish group who had to have the right number of people to be able to celebrate the Sabbath. And he would volunteer to go along and just make up numbers for them, even though he was a Catholic. Scott Grimwood said, did these visas work after Japan went to war with the US? Well, it didn't really matter because we're talking about 1940. It's worth pointing out that not a single one of the Jews who left Lithuania due to Svartendijk and Sugihara ended up in Curacao. Not a single one. They all ended up going elsewhere. Anyway, back to Anton Schmidt. He ran this electrical repair workshop in Lithuania, in Vilnius. When the war started, he was mobilized. He ended up in one of the security divisions because he was too old for frontline service. He ended up in Vilnius with several other men from his division. And he was given a number of jobs. He was put in charge of an office based at the railway station, which was responsible for getting stragglers back to their units. So he would work out where the division was. Yes, Schmidt was an Austrian. He was from Vienna. So he would work out where their units were. He would put them on a train to the nearest railway station, etc. He would also have to notify units when soldiers who had been in hospitals in Vilnius died, etc. He oversaw an upholstery repair workshop next door, repairing upholstery from damaged vehicles, etc., which was manned by a mixture of Jews and Soviet prisoners of war. Most of the workers in his office were Jews, and he discovered two interesting things. These Jews, who are now in the ghetto, told him that their Wehrmacht identity cards, which he issued to them, were known to the Jews as Todesurlaubsscheine, holiday from death passes, because it gave them some protection against arrest. It also gave them enough rations to survive and for their families to survive. The other interesting thing that Schmidt discovered was he had absolutely nobody overseeing him. So he could issue as many of these passes as he liked. So by the time we get towards the winter of 1941-42, Schmidt has 150 Jews working for him in this office. It's just a ludicrous number. But, you know, whatever. He started providing shelter for Jews who were on the run, including people of the resistance. If we move on to the next slide, he encountered this priest, Andrzej Godowski, who was the priest in the Church of St. Teresa of Avila in Vilnius. Godowski had worked in Vienna at one point, and when Schmidt turned up for Mass one day, he recognized Schmidt's accent as Viennese, and the pair of them got on very well. One day, Schmidt met a Jewish girl called Luisa Emaitisita, who needed documentation to prove that she wasn't Jewish. He took her to Godowski and asked him to forge some documents. Godowski replied that he was old enough that he didn't really care about being answerable to any human beings, and as for being answerable to God, well, he would make his peace with God in due time. So he produced documents saying that Louisa was a Catholic girl whose parents had been deported by the Soviets during the year of occupation, and hence her documents had been destroyed. So he managed to get her certified as a non-Jew, and he then promptly employed her in his office as his typist. There was a male Jew called Max Salinger. At the time, Schmidt had documents that he was going to forward on to a unit saying that a soldier with the first name of Max had died in a military hospital. Instead, he altered the documents and notified this unit saying that Salinger had recovered from his wounds but was not fit to return to frontline service, so he was detaining him in Vilnius to work in his office. So this Jewish man, Salinger, became a corporal in the Wehrmacht. He drew Wehrmacht pay, got a Wehrmacht uniform, and worked in Schmidt's office.
Crazy.
It's an extraordinary story, really, isn't it? If we move on to the next slide, Anna Bolkowska, and this probably will reduce me to tears, she was the Sister Superior in a nunnery just outside Vilnius. She sheltered a large number of Jewish resistance workers. She also secured weapons for them, including hand grenades. At one point, she volunteered to take the place of one of them when they were saying they had to return to the ghetto. And she said, I will fight on your behalf. She was eventually arrested by the Gestapo. She spent much of the war in concentration camps, and we will return to her story later if there's time. But just
give you a break to recover yourself momentarily. And it's a question I've asked Waitman and others as well, is that when you're talking, as we talked at the top of the show about the millions are victims of this, and now you're telling us these stories that are amazing, they are inspirational, they are moving, but we're still talking about an absolute minority compared to those that were killed. We're talking about a tiny, tiny majority of people. Given that the overwhelming numbers with the Holocaust are of victims, why is it, and I'm just being kind of provocative with the question, why is it important to tell these stories of the heroes, even though they're against the trend?
Well, there's a book out at the moment in the bestsellers charts by Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's old spin doctor, entitled "But What Can I Do?" And that's why I'm telling these stories, because these were just individuals who just said, "What can I do?" And this was the answer that they came up with. Schmidt himself started transporting some of the Jews he was hiding to Belarus, because at the time Belarus was still under Wehrmacht control and the Jews were safer there than under SS control in Lithuania. Unfortunately, one of the Jews he transferred was a criminal who broke into a church to steal some belongings, and he was arrested, handed over to the Geheime Feldpolizei, that's the military equivalent of the Gestapo. They asked him how he had got there and offered him immunity from prosecution if he told them. He told them that Schmidt had taken him there, and they promptly executed him and then arrested Schmidt. Schmidt was charged with abetting the enemies of Germany in wartime. His military lawyer attempted to run a defense along the lines of he was saving valuable workers for the Wehrmacht. He rejected that himself in his court-martial under cross-examination and said, "I did this out of humanity." Which basically, he must have known he was signing his own death warrant by doing so. He was found guilty, and in March 1942, he was executed by firing squad. When news returned to Vienna, local crowds gathered outside his wife's apartment and threw stones and smashed the windows.
Wow. It would be a pertinent time to ask Peter O'Connell's question. Given the German and Soviet intelligence service acumen penetrating opposing organizations, how big a role did counterintelligence operation play in this struggle?
I'm not sure what are you asking here?
Well, breaking in these various schemes with people who are working within the structure to help people get out. How were the Nazis trying to?
Well, Schmidt was helped by a former comrade from his old security division who held a similar role in Belarus. But that person was never named in any of the documents. Most of these people were working as individuals, and therefore there weren't networks that could be, broken into or whatever. The point that a couple have made about the Vatican and Catholic involvement in the Holocaust, that is why I wanted to mention Anna Borkowska and Father Godowski, because it just makes the point that, amidst all of this horror, there were good people at almost every level. And, I kind of hold on to the hope that for the ones that we know about, there were others that we never knew about who were also doing good things. And undoubtedly, a lot
Very
of
good point.
a lot of the people in these organizations were acting very badly, but there were still individuals who rose above that. And, that's what role models are. These are people who go against the tide. These are the people who stand out when everybody else, loses their moral compass. The next slide is another individual who never lost his moral compass. Karl Plagge was a soldier in the First World War. He became a British prisoner at the end of the war, and in his prison camp he contracted polio, which left him with a permanently weak leg. He joined the Nazi Party in the early 30s because he, like many others, saw the Nazis as the only means of Germany restoring its pride and self-confidence. Almost immediately, he clashed with the authorities about their racial views. He had hoped this was purely an electoral ploy. When he realized this was actually very fundamental to the way the Nazis worked, he began to distance himself from the Nazis. When the war began, he was an engineer. He was mobilized and was put in charge of a vehicle repair workshop, which ended up in Vilnius. HKP 562, his unit was responsible for the repair of wheeled vehicles from Army Group North that could not be repaired at divisional level. So, trucks, cars, Kübelwagens, etc., would end up back in Vilnius where his workshops would fix them. Inevitably, this required a large workforce, and they were mainly, Jewish workers and local Poles and Lithuanians. From the very start, Plagge went out of his way to be enormously kind to the Jews. He ordered his medical staff to provide medical help for them. He provided meals for his Jewish workers. He even extracted various Jews who had been arrested by the SS and by the Gestapo and got them released, even on occasion Jews who weren't even working for him. So here was a man who worked. He didn't break the rules like Plagge. He worked like Schmidt. He worked within the rules, but he did everything he could to keep his Jews alive for as long as he could. And it became known amongst the Jews in the ghetto that working for Plagge's organization was a good thing. You wouldn't be abused. He was very, very hard on any of his soldiers who mistreated the Jews. There was one who beat a Jew. When one of his officers complained to this, remonstrated with this sergeant saying, "You shouldn't beat the Jews. The major has said you not to do this." This sergeant threatened this lieutenant by saying, "I have friends in the SS, and I can get you into trouble." So he was then summoned to Plagge's office, and Plagge presented him with transfer documents to a Waffen SS unit saying, "If you're so fond of killing Jews, you can go to the front line. There are plenty of Jews in the Red Army. Go and do your bit there," and kicked him out. So Plagge was, he was employing well over 1,000 Jews in his workshops and providing them with a great deal of care, and doing everything he could within the rules. He was not, I say within the rules. Extracting prisoners from prison when they weren't even working for him is kind of, outside those rules. But another great man, and we're going to stay with him for a bit longer. So on the next slide. In 1943, there was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which was suppressed by the SS. And the Stroop report that was written afterwards included this photograph, which for me is just one of the most terrible photographs of the entire war. Just look at this boy at the front. What sort of world is it that has a small child having to raise his arms like that? What has he already experienced? What horrors await him when he is taken away from Warsaw to the death camps? Remember this image because it's important. We're going to come back to this. The result of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was that Himmler ordered the liquidation of all the ghettos. So when the ghetto in Lithuania was cleared, Plagge decided to move his workers to a new work camp. So if we move on to the next slide, he identified these two buildings in southeast Vilnius. Ironically, these had been built at the turn of the century by a Jewish industrialist to house his workers. But Plagge persuaded the SS to allow him to house his workers here, though the camp itself remained under the control of the SS. Once he'd moved his workers here, he also moved their families and children, and he kept them there on the grounds on 2 points. The first was he persuaded the SS that happy workers are productive workers, and if his workers didn't have their families with them, they would not be productive. Secondly, he managed to persuade a local firm that had a contract for repairing Wehrmacht uniforms to subcontract work to him. He put some sewing machines up in the loft space of these buildings, so the women and older children worked there, so he could make a case these were useful workers. So his Jews were now housed here, and from here they would go out to the various workshops around Vilnius during the day and then return here at night. The rest of the ghetto was cleared. The workers were either sent off to the oil shale mines in Estonia, or else they were sent off to Auschwitz and elsewhere where they died. The next slide, though, this work camp remained under the control of the SS. And at the end of March 1944, there took place, to my mind, one of the cruelest events of the Holocaust. Himmler decided that all children were surplus mouths at a difficult time for Germany, in the surplus mouths in the concentration camps and work camps, so they were to be killed. So those of you in the audience who are parents, those of you who have children in your lives, just imagine this. One day, several trucks of Lithuanian paramilitaries led by Martin Weiss, who we encountered earlier on, arrive at this workplace. The soldiers stand in line with bayonets fixed, and over their shoulders you can see them rounding up the children from these two accommodation blocks, dragging them out, and literally throwing them into waiting trucks. Some of the mothers begged to go with their children, even though they knew they were being taken away to be killed. One woman confronted Weiss. He turned away from her. She confronted him again and spat in his face. He produced his gun and shot her in the head in front of her children. It's just the most horrible thing you can ever imagine. Michael Good, who coincidentally is also a family doctor, just recently retired in America. He is the son of two Jewish survivors from Vilnius. His mother was a child in the work camp and was one of those who successfully hid. And when Michael Good wrote about what happened, he came across another survivor who had been a child. And in the 1990s, this survivor told him this extraordinary story of, he said, there was this kid in the work camp. He wasn't part of our gang. But he was amazing. This kid could draw. You could give him a scrap of paper and a pencil. He could draw you anything. And I remember running up the staircase to hide in the loft. And I looked down the stairwell, and there was this boy looking up at me. And I shouted to him, "You got to come with us." And he just stood there, and I had to go. And I could hear the Lithuanians coming up the stairs. After he published his book, Michael Good received a letter from the Pucker Gallery in Boston telling him that Samuel Bach, this Jewish child artist, had survived. This is a drawing that Bach did in 1947 of the Kinderaktion. In 1951, whilst in Israel, Bach came across that photograph we saw earlier on from the Stroop report. And if we go on to the next slide, that boy became an emblem in his artwork. And Bach has produced well over 1,000 pictures. And this image recurs again and again. And if we go on to the next slide too. But this is, I guess, what I mean about keeping this personal. You know, remember the people that are behind all these numbers. Anyway, onwards. So what happens after the war? Here we go. The imperfections of justice. Reinhard Heydrich, as most of you probably know, was assassinated by Czech partisans. They attempted to machine gun his car in Prague. They were armed with Sten guns, which incredibly jammed, who'd have thought? But one of them threw a hand grenade into the car, which exploded. Heydrich was injured, and he would have survived, except the wound included horsehair from the stuffing of the upholstery in the car, and became infected. And again, whilst as an ex-doctor, I'm not going to rejoice in the suffering of anybody, nor am I going to be particularly sorry that he died in extreme pain after several days. Stahlecker, the head of Einsatzgruppe A, was killed as a result of a drive-by shooting. His Einsatzgruppe headquarters was in a town that at the time was known as Krasnogvardesk, not far from Leningrad, now known as Gatchina. He was wounded in the leg. He was flown to Riga in early 1942, where he underwent surgery for a ruptured femoral artery. He was then put on a plane to Prague, where his family lived. During the flight, the wound began to bleed again, and he was dead on arrival. Again, no complaints from me. Karl Jäger, the older soldier from the First World War who headed up Einsatzkommando 3 in Lithuania, he left Lithuania in 1942, I think, or early 43. Became head of police in a town in the Sudetenland. At the end of the war, he abandoned his second wife and his small child, returned to his hometown in the Black Forest, where he lived quite openly as a farm labourer. Karl Jäger is not an uncommon name, after all, but he didn't hide his SS past. He was finally arrested, I think, in 1959. He insisted that he had not personally killed anybody. He had just passed on all the legitimate orders of a legitimate government. Yet, despite his protestations of innocence, he hanged himself before he could be brought to justice. Joachim Hamann, the blonde anti-Semitic commander of the eponymous Rollkommando that massacred the rural Jews of Lithuania, he was one of the Gestapo officers sent to arrest Erwin Rommel in 1944. In 1945, he shot himself rather than face almost certain prosecution. Martin Weiss, Weiss der Schwarz, who oversaw the Kinderaktion and other actions, including some of the killings at Panari, was prosecuted by the German authorities in the late 1940s. I think he was sentenced to 20-something years imprisonment. He was released on parole after serving 12 years for his various crimes. Not much of a punishment, but it gets worse if we go on to the next slide. Bruno Kittel, the dapper piano-playing killer, disappeared. He may have died at the end of the war, one of the nameless corpses all over Europe. My own suspicion is the former actor just put on another role and disappeared. He was never found. He was never prosecuted. He never faced charges for his crimes. Gustav Grauer, who we haven't mentioned until now, but I will, because this is really interesting, and this gives you some insight into how so many of these people escaped. Grauer was a subordinate of Karl Jäger, so he was roughly the same sort of level as Joachim Hamann, the guy who shot himself in 1945 and had been one of the ones who tried to arrest Rommel. Grauer became a Soviet prisoner of war at the end of the war and went into captivity. And as most of you will probably know, the Soviets held on to a large number of Austrian German prisoners at the end of the war and didn't release them until 1955. And when they did release them, Andreas Demjanjuk was Lithuanian. I don't know, was he Latvian? Oh, bugger, I'm going to have to look this up now. Oh, I shouldn't. I glanced across that. Anyway, back to Gustav Grauer. He was a prisoner of the Soviets. When they released everybody else, they also released a list of all the people who had died in captivity, and Grauer's name was on that list.
Right.
Which should be the end of the story, except it isn't, because I discovered a declassified CIA document from 1961, which showed Grauer was not only alive and well, but he was serving in German intelligence in Berlin. And the CIA wanted a word with him because he had been in a car with two other people, which nearly strayed into East Berlin. This was immediately before the Berlin Wall went up. And the other two members of the car, or the other two people in the car, had been arrested as suspected Soviet agents. Grauer had claimed that he was in the process of being abducted and taken off to the east. But this very, very brief report that I have a copy of by the CIA agent says that he doesn't believe this story, and he thinks it's important that they have an interview with Grauer to discover the truth. And that's all I've got. And I couldn't find out what happened to him, whether he was interviewed, when he died, whatever. But there you are. A lot of these people ended up working for intelligence services in the West, some of them in working for the intelligence services in the East. And when you think about this, so Grauer was a Soviet prisoner of war. They released him. He ends up working for the BND in Germany. Had they sent him back and told him to use some of his old contacts to get in there? And was he always a Soviet agent? Was he in the process of being debriefed when this car incident happened? We will just never know. But you know, the loyalties of the Cold War and the agents and double agents, it is just the most murky stuff, and people are going to be writing about this for a very, very long time. Franz Murer, though, now the person I would love to see spending time in eternal damnation. Murer he returned to the Luftwaffe and became an artillery officer in the Luftwaffe Field Division at the end of the war. He was captured in northern Italy at the end of the war, but because his documentation said he was a Luftwaffe officer, he was then released. There was nothing to say he had been in the SS. In 1947, he was arrested in the almost farcical manner possible. Two Jews were from a displaced persons camp in Carinthia, were traveling to local farms trying to exchange their tinned rations from their DP camp for fresh chicken, because they wanted to make a traditional chicken soup for Yom Kippur. As they were passing a farm, they passed an Austrian worker, and they said to him, "Should we go up to the farm and ask if they got chickens?" And the farmer said, and this guy said, "Well, actually, they're under current laws, because chickens are scarce, they're not allowed to give them away. But in any case, I really wouldn't go up there. that farm belongs to a real Jew hater, and he'll just turn his dogs on you. They returned to the DP camp and they contacted Simon Wiesenthal at his center in Linz and said, "We have found Eichmann," because at this stage everybody was obsessed with finding Adolf Eichmann. So Wiesenthal travelled down to Carinthia, not at all convinced they had found Eichmann. He went to the local police station and asked, "Who lives up in that farm up on the hill?" And the local police said, "Well, you mean Herr Müller?" Now, Wiesenthal knew enough about what had been happening to know who Müller was. He went to the DP camp. He found enough Lithuanian Jews who could give him affidavits. He went to the local British occupation authorities. The military police turned up at the farm to find Müller with his bags packed, about to depart. Somebody in the police station had tipped him off. But he was arrested. The British didn't really know what to do with him, so they handed him over to the Soviets. The Soviets shipped him off to the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, where he was put on trial in Vilnius. And, you know, they say the devil looks after his own. Well, immediately before he came to trial, the Soviet Union had abolished the death penalty. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. And shortly after, the death penalty was reinstated. But he was sent off to a lead mine up in the north, which would have been fatal, except he was then transferred after a year. He was released in 1955, along with all the other prisoners. And when he returned to Austria, the Austrian authorities decided he had served enough time and released him. In 1961, as many of you probably know, Adolf Eichmann was finally caught by the Israelis, taken back to Jerusalem, put on trial and executed. And under enormous pressure, the Germans started taking war crimes rather more seriously than they had on some occasions, as did the Austrians. Wiesenthal prepared a new set of charges against Müller. He was brought to trial. He was charged, I think, with 15 counts of murder. His son sat in the front row of the public gallery, openly mocking the Jewish witnesses. One Jewish witness broke down in the witness box. The judge admonished her for crying in his courtroom. She replied, "Sir, I am describing the moment when the accused shot my sister and her brains were splattered across my feet." One of the jurors had to be dismissed because it turned out he had been a member of the SS. Another juror told a local reporter he had no intention of finding Herr Müller guilty of anything, regardless of the evidence he heard. Müller was acquitted on all but, I think, 3 murder charges where the jury was tied. And because it was tied, the judge cast his vote in favor of the presumption of innocence. He was carried out of the courtroom by a cheering crowd of supporters who were then seen to be celebrating in a bar across the road from the courthouse with the jury. A few days later, it transpired that the judge had been an active judge during the war and had been an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazis. There were various attempts to bring him to justice again, but it didn't happen. He died a wealthy man. I think in about 2010, 2012, his son, who became a right-wing politician in Austria, announced that a forthcoming book would vindicate his father and exonerate him completely. So here we are in 2023, and no such book has ever appeared. But, you know, people got away with this either because people wanted to look the other way and they didn't want to keep on dredging up the past. When, for example, there was a festival in Waldkirch where Karl Jäger had grown up, and in the bit about the history of the history of Waldkirch in the little pamphlet that they produced, they'd included prominent citizens, and they'd included Franz Murer. Beg your pardon, they'd included Karl Jäger as this prominent person, and eventually they apologised for this. But a local politician went on German radio saying, you know, where do we draw a line? We've got to stop harking back to the past at some point. Really? And you know, somebody else touched on this. You know, about the West covering. Well, there were others. There's another SS officer involved in the Kaunas concentration camp who was absolutely protected by the Canadian authorities. He was allowed to emigrate to Canada, even though he was a known SS member. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police refused to extradite him to Germany to face war crimes trials because his name had been misspelt. And they didn't tell the Germans why they had refused it. Eventually, the German Justice Minister spoke to the Canadian Justice Minister, and proceedings were ongoing when this guy died of old age. There was an enormous amount of this going on. People were deemed as useful in the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, well, the only historians I can think about who's actually addressed this period post-war and what was going on with the mindset is Tim Cook, the Canadian, in his book. You know, he tackled the trial of Kurt Meyer and things like that, and was trying to understand why the Canadian mindset was the way it was in that post-war period. And he put a few things in there about people being jaded and fed up with death and just suffering from what we would label PTSD, etc., etc., etc. But he ultimately came with this: it doesn't make sense now. It's a period of history that we look at it now and go, why was there not more attempt to bring these people to justice? And yeah, it's an odd period in history. I'm thinking of tackling it at some point on the channel, but I think we'd end up just coming away with no strong conclusions as to why it went the way it went.
It's a very difficult issue because, you know, this whole it's something I've wrestled with my writing so much, that so much of the English language narrative of the Eastern Front is actually based upon German narratives written after the war, because by the time the history was written, the Soviet Union was the new enemy and the Germans were now our new allies. So the need to rehabilitate West Germany was so overriding that people were prepared to look the other way. It's wrong, but it's what happened, you know. And it wasn't, you know, and bless you, Norma, it wasn't just the Canadians who were at fault. The Canadians are probably one of the minor offenders here. You know, the Americans and the British were absolutely knee deep in this, as were the French. You know, there was a huge amount of sheltering of these people. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of this guy that the Canadians sheltered. I will look it up in a moment if I have a chance. But we're getting to the end now, so if we go on here.
Final slide.
Memories. The symbol at the bottom left is the medal awarded by Yad Vashem to the righteous amongst the nations, and both Karl Plagge and Anton Schmidt were awarded this. I think Anton Schmidt was the first Wehrmacht member to be awarded this medal. Plagge was awarded it after the representations of Michael Good and his mother. I think it took 3 applications for Yad Vashem to be persuaded. Andrzej Godowski, Anna Borkowska, the nun that we came across earlier on, after she was released from a concentration camp at the end of the war, she turned her face against the Catholic Church on the grounds that no God who allowed this to happen was worthy of her praise.
Wow.
She lived in Warsaw in some poverty, where Abba Kofner, who was one of the Jewish resistance fighters who had known her in the war, he found her and presented her with her medal. And he said to her, at a time when the angels turn their faces from us, you are Anna of the angels.
Wow.
The Bundeswehr renamed 2 of its barracks after Karl Plagge and Anton Schmidt. The Anton Schmidt Kaserne was deeply unpopular. because it replaced the name of some 19th century Prussian officer, and local taxi drivers refused to take people to the Anton Schmidt Kaserne, etc., etc. You know, for goodness sake. Sadly, whatever, it was one of the numerous military bases that was closed down at the end of the Cold War. The memorial plaque to Anton Schmidt was then moved to a firing range in Schleswig-Holstein. That too has now been closed down, and the plaque is now in a museum. The plaque at the bottom right, I found in a fairly modern, built in the 1950s or 60s in Vienna, on the site of where Schmidt had lived. Modern block of flats, and this is one of the archways. Anton Schmidt, born in 1900, executed in 1942, NCO in the German Wehrmacht, saved hundreds of Jewish citizens in the Vilnius ghetto from certain death. And a quote from one of his letters, "Ich habe ja nur Menschen gerettet." All I did was save people.
Mm.
And that is probably a good note on which to finish.
No, it absolutely is, and I'm glad you're finishing on. It's hardly a bright spot, but it's a more inspirational spot amongst all the figures, because I knew you'd be bringing us a balanced view of this with and a show just listing all the perpetrators and all the crimes. After a while, it becomes repetitive, but it fails in its purpose. It doesn't have becomes unrelenting. And I see viewing numbers drop off when those things happen.
It really does numb your brain. You need, we are human beings. We need humans that we can link to, and we can see this through their eyes. And I would recommend to anybody, look up the artwork of Samuel Bach, surname is B-A-K. His paintings just ache with sorrow and loss. And they are just, I'm proud to have 2 prints of his up in my house. There's something very poignant about this, because you think of all those children who were taken off in the Kinderaktion and died. And then you see this one who survived against the odds, and what an incredible body of work he produced. And you think of all that was lost. And then you think of all of the people who were killed in the Holocaust, and indeed elsewhere in the Second World. It doesn't matter whether they were killed in the Holocaust or in the bombing raids or whatever. Just think about this, and you think of all of those accomplishments and achievements that were lost to mankind, and then you take a step back and you think, and then all of the others who might not have been accomplished artists or writers or scientists or whatever, these were still futures that weren't lived. And, you see the terrible suffering that continues around the world now. And these senseless wars, these, even today, an utterly senseless missile attack on a civilian area in Kharkiv. Forgive the language, but what the fuck is that about?
I know, yeah. And it's ultimately, it is why, without taking any credit for what I'm doing here, but for taking credit for you and your writing, is why these discussions are important, in that there is lots of YouTube content about World War II where it is still comparing tanks. In fact, you've come on and talked about tank design as well, and they are interesting conversations, and historians will need to have those conversations in order to understand how battles were fought and won. But ultimately, the thing I'm proudest of with this channel is these conversations with people like yourself that are about the human spirit, the human in all its forms, the awfulness of how humans can be, and also how wonderful humans can be at times. Because I have mixed feelings listening to you, because on the one hand, I despise, and I think, how can people like some of the people you've talked about exist? How can people so horrible and so, but also how can people like the nun, like the others, how can they be there as well? It makes me think. It confuses me, but it also it inspires me. So thank you very much, Prit, and thank you very much for for doing what has been obviously a bit of a difficult presentation. We'll continue it by going back 20 years tomorrow on World War One TV. But yeah, Prit, the comments flying in on the sidebar about how important the conversation was. I think it's you've never been anything but a fantastic guest on the channel, but this possibly is your Sergeant Pepper. I don't know. It's your.
Well, thank you so much, because of all of the things I've written about, this, as I said earlier, this was easily the hardest. Emotionally, it was a hugely punishing thing to write about. But it was also something that I felt very, very driven to write about. It was so important that these stories are shared, and because like I said, it allows us to engage at a very personal and emotional level. And if you don't, then can you really say that emotionally you can? Do you really feel that 1 million deaths are that much worse than 100,000 deaths? It's only when you attach individuals to this story that it brings it home of just how terrible it was.
No, indeed, and I feel that by doing these kind of shows, it then gives me the right to have more of the kind of, not the fun discussions, but the discussions where we are talking about the weaponry and the tactics, and the more positive isn't the right word, but the simpler discussions. These ones are the homework we have to do to ground ourselves in the reality of those of us that spend an inordinate amount of our lives talking about conflict need to be reminded frequently the human results of conflict. And it's all very well as half of our mutual friends, they make models of Sherman tanks, and they watch their war films, and they munch on their popcorn, and I do that as well. But it's important every now and then to just be grounded with something like this. So again, thanks, Prit. No more superlatives other than the fact you're fantastic. I'm honored that you're a guest here, and I'm honored that you're a friend as well. And I will come up to Scotland and learn how to cook curries with you at some point. That's on the cards. But I will see you again tomorrow night, Prit. Thanks very much, viewers. Don't forget, there's 2 shows tomorrow. One on World War II TV at 3 p.m. UK time. We are talking about deep operations in the Red Army with Improbable Matter, who is a famous YouTube science host. And then we've got the show on World War One TV at 7 p.m. UK with Prit, talking about the formation of the Baltic states. So don't forget, that's on the other channel. Thank you, everybody. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Cheers, Prit. Thanks for your fantastic sidebar. This is Paul Woodley for World War II TV saying see you all again tomorrow. Bye.